We are caught in an inseparable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Basic truths that then inspires, because if you really get that, and not only get it philosophically, intellectually, and that's the beauty. It's a great place where Martin Luther King Day and Dharma practice connect. Because Dharma practice at its best does become a type of activism, because through the experience of it, you gain an experience of the independent nature of all things. That my interest in happiness, my ability to be happy, is totally intertwined with my concern for yours. Thanks for being here. Happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day. I always say this, but I say it almost like as if I'm trying to make it be this way, but I always feel like, to me, this is the most important American holiday. Of course, it's not treated as such. We can try to treat it that way, like ourselves, if we resonate with that idea. There's no real consumerism around it, so it's hard to make it a great holiday in America. There's no real gifts to give, but there is a great gift that I think we have, and I always try to remember, and thankful to remember right now, to start with giving thanks to Coretta Scott King for making that we have this holiday. It was her that fought for this and made this happen. And we celebrate Dr. King, and we hold him kind of high as the leader. After all, the moment he was born, the constellation of Aries was on the eastern horizon. So his ascendant is the Aries, and it's called Ashwini. It has the Shakti to move places quickly. And so he was someone who was Aries is the mythology of Aries is the leader, and to climb to great heights, and to be the first and the best, and to climb to the top of the mountain. And very poetically, his life ended with his final speech, is famously called his mountaintop speech. And if you never watched it, you must. It's so emotional. It's so extraordinary. But to do something meaningful on Martin Luther King Jr. Day and you're not sure what to do, go over to YouTube and spend a half hour listening to his final talk. Where he was sick that night. It was raining, didn't want to come out. He sent Ralph Abernathy to speak in his place. But everybody wanted Dr. King, of course. And they were there supporting the striking sanitary workers. Also very appropriate. And that's a phenomenal thing that we even have it on recording. And I say it's the most important holiday because I think it represents the best of what America is. And America is a complicated thing that's full of beautiful things, full of catastrophe, tragedy, and greatness. And all of that is in this story, and all of it, and the best of what we are and what we can be is in this story. And in what this represents. His dear friend, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, said that the future of America will kind of be dependent on how much the influence of that movement has on the nation. America is an experiment. This thing is an experiment. It's not something that's necessarily will be around forever. The empires come and go. And so he defined what he called the 4 catastrophes of America. We could also say of modern civilization, really, because now everything is totally inseparable. And check this out. I read this earlier. A friend of mine posted this one line. This is from his letter that he wrote from the Birmingham jail in 1963. And he said, in a real sense, we are caught in an inseparable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. That's Tantric Buddhism. Inseparable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Basic truths that then inspires, because if you really get that, and not only get it philosophically, intellectually, and that's the beauty. It's a great place where Martin Luther King Day and Dharma practice connect. Because Dharma practice at its best does become a type of activism, because through the experience of it, you gain an experience of the independent nature of all things. That my interest in happiness, my ability to be happy, is totally intertwined with my concern for yours. Not only is it my happiness intertwined with your happiness, but my wish for your happiness, my concern for your happiness. And then that also, as long as that only extends, like he's speaking in 1963 and talking about inseparability and mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny between different states in this context. He's in Georgia, and then that state over is Alabama. But then later in his life, and he was really unpopular because of it, he called the war on Vietnam an evil war at a time where that was a very unpopular opinion. And so at the time of his death, less than 50%, his approval rating in the United States amongst all races was less than 50%. Martin Luther King Jr. The fact of the matter is, he was someone who made people uncomfortable. And when time passes, time shows all things. So how does history look at things? Well, history looks at, this stuff is relevant, as relevant today. The 4 catastrophes, what are they? I was going to call this class the 4 catastrophes, but then I thought nobody would come. And then it was already kind of dreary. It's called 1,000 Midnights. And for years now, every Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we do something I like to teach. And in 1,000 Midnights is a phrasing I took from his acceptance speech, of the Nobel Peace Prize, where he said, "When our days are dreary with low hovering clouds, and our nights are darker than 1,000 midnights, we will know that we are experiencing the creative turmoil of a genuine civilization struggling to be born." We are not yet a genuine civilization. In some ways, perhaps, that's the famous line when Gandhi was asked, what do you think of British civilization? He's like, I would love to see it. It's kind of the same, What is American civilization? But when our days are dark and dreary, and our nights are darker than 1,000 midnights, we will know that we are experiencing. It's not all negative, His phrasing is so masterful. We will know that we are experiencing the creative turmoil. That word just tells you there's something, a creative turmoil of a genuine civilization struggling to be born. So the 4 catastrophes is the imperial catastrophe, which is militarism and the military-industrial complex. And by its very presence, it skews our priorities. It skews and distorts our ability to see clearly. Because you can't believe in natural dependent nature on each other. You can't believe in the interwoven connectivity of all things. Not if you're going to bomb all these little babies. You can't do it. And be okay with that, you can't. And so that brings to what he called the spiritual catastrophe of materialism. And when that which is material becomes more supreme than that which is long-lasting, also it skews perspective, it distorts the mind. And then there's the economic catastrophe of poverty. And then the moral catastrophe of racism and the superiority complex of race. So militarism, is the imperial catastrophe. Materialism is what he called the spiritual catastrophe. Poverty is, and that was at the time of his death. Great, I always recommend, if nobody's seen it, great film called King in the Wilderness is 1,000% worth watching. It was just came out several years ago, HBO original, and it's about the last year. It's about the last year of his life, really. And you see how depressed he was, and how with the heavy burden of responsibility. Yeah, he had when he was born on the ascendant was Aries, but in that ascendant of Aries was the planet Jupiter. And they say it's like the best thing that can happen in the horoscope is when Jupiter is on the ascendant at the time of birth, or in other words, Jupiter placed in the first house takes away 10 million blemishes from the horoscope. That's either good news or bad news. First of all, did you realize there were 10 million blemishes in the horoscope? These are just kind of, in a certain way, poetic ways of making a point. It's that it doesn't mean it's going to be an easy life. Obviously not. There was nothing easy about this life. What was he, 36? When he was assassinated, something like that, 39, 38. Yeah, this is, wow, but an old soul. And so Saturn, if you would have looked up at the time he was born about right there, then Saturn would have been there in the 9th house, the house of the teacher, the house of the guru, and the house of the preacher, which he was. To me, I always think, when I think Dr. King, I think first and foremost a devotee of Christ. And and clearly that was where everything else came from. That was his, what they would call in India, his devata, the focal point of his worship, the way he connected to the infinite. So anyways, there was, the third one is racism is the moral catastrophe, and poverty is the economic catastrophe. And the point, though, that he would make is that you cannot separate the four. That you can't address one without addressing all of them. The military-industrial complex is totally tied into the economic complex. The military-industrial complex, all of them are obviously connected to the spiritual catastrophe. But in the United States, we are not a religious, it's not, you have freedom to worship any way you want or to not worship at all. That's the ideal. And so therefore, we're not all Christians, or we're not all Jews, or we're not all Muslims, or we're not all anything. So somehow we need a secular spirituality that goes across boundaries. And that's a simple idea of one more time. We are caught in an inseparable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So it need not be religious. It need not be our spirituality, as a people, really only need to be via our connection with each other and acknowledgement that the same way I am suffering, you are also suffering, even if I can't stand you. You know what I mean? What, y'all don't have people you can't stand? Everybody does, That doesn't mean you don't have love. So part of it is there has to be a realness present in order to practice spirituality at the basic level, because to me, spirituality is the opening and the blossoming of authenticity. Who is the real me? What is this really all about? And that then takes you down a bit of the rabbit hole, because that who is the real me question doesn't get answered quite quickly. It just continues and continues and continues. In fact, it's like the never-ending question of who is the real me, what is this, what is the real us? But what we can definitely witness and experience by going down that journey, and that's one of the great things that yoga practice and Dharma practice does, maybe the greatest thing that it does, is it gives you the experience of the interwovenness of life. And that's a blissful experience, actually. It's not some heavy thing. When you recognize via your inner experience that you're interconnected with all living things, not just the humans. It's amazing. It's blissful. So in a certain way is by getting into that subtle nature of what we are and what this all is, it opens us, it makes us blissful, but then that does give us the inconvenient reality that our way that we think about things changes. Because if I'm having a genuine experience of the inseparability of life, which is a very abstract thing to talk about, but it's not an abstract thing to experience. It's totally real and deep, and mystical and wonderful. It's that not only does it bring joy, it brings compassion. So then the ideologies that we may have been holding in our lives, many that we've inherited from our families, and those sometimes are the strong ones. Sometimes we have really strong ones that were inherited via trauma that we experienced, particularly if we experienced trauma in the early part of life. You know, I grew up feeling that when I would see, for instance, an Israeli flag, very positive. Every weekend, I would stand up in my Hebrew school and sing the Israeli national anthem every week. We would do that. And so it was always a symbol of like something great, something, it represented something beautiful. And it still does, but not anymore in the same way. Not that flag. For me personally. It's just for me personally. I can't, But the governments never represent the people in that way. They just don't. I was noticing this with deadheads, not changing the subject too much. In real life, I've never met a mean deadhead. I've never been at a dead show and maybe I have. The vast majority of deadheads I meet are the loveliest people, especially at a dead show. On the internet, these motherfuckers are the meanest people you can find. You post something about some song and they know something better and they're like, what a dick, what a dork, da, 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 da. It's like, they're like the meanest, most evil, horrible. You would never want to hang out with the internet version of deadheads that I see on these threads. So we're all confused, a little bit, and our perspectives are getting skewed about how other people are. When we meet people in real life and we can just have a conversation and communicate, and mostly be compassion and remember that other person is suffering, just the same that you and I are suffering. They are suffering, and they may have a total different opinion or experience. But the fact that they're suffering and that we are also suffering does not change. Does not change. Also growing up, I have the American flag. I pledge allegiance to that. It's a beautiful thing. It was like a symbol of great, freedom but then you learn about other things. Ooh, I don't see that same thing. But it doesn't mean that the symbols have to get dragged down into what the actually doesn't represent. So this experiment of our world and our civilization right now, our attempt for civilization, everything is, what's different now than when Dr. King was alive is everything is highly connected across the planet. So at one point it's like a division between Atlanta and Alabama, Georgia and Alabama. That's a pretty big, there can be, pretty big even cultural gaps from state to state. But they were all connected because on the news every night they're watching one channel, or Walter Cronkite is coming on. And everybody's kind of being served the similar narratives. Now what's happened, everything is so highly connected. We're all being served different narratives. Whatever the narratives are that we resonate, then the machine that is this kind of interconnected technology world, it's kind of puts you, we all know this, puts us in our own echo chamber that kind of reinforces our own perspectives. And it's creating a type of polarized experience on the planet right now that could combust. So we have to be mindful of that. That's why Martin Luther King Jr. Day is an important holiday. Because maybe it'll help us contemplate these things a little, like soften our heart a little bit. And try, it doesn't mean we don't have something that we stand for, and quite the opposite. Absolutely. It gives us conviction to stand with in what we're all about. But that type of activism that lacks compassion, whether it's the compassion for the oppressor or compassion for the oppressed, both are in a tremendous state of suffering. Compassion never justifies something. Compassion isn't saying, that's okay. No, it's not. Compassion will keep love there even though it's not okay. Because it's acknowledging inside of it is the wisdom of suffering. And the wisdom of the wish for happiness that each of us share. Each of us are trying to be happy. Happiness, though, can be very elusive. So that's why the yogis, they create sadhanas for themselves, practices for themselves that help stay connected to the things that don't change, the thing that isn't elusive. But that thing that isn't elusive is tremendously subtle. The thing that's the part of us that exists even prior to coming into this body, and that which will stay carrying along even after this body and this mind and all the narratives that it's holding dissipates. The yogi is just saying, find out what remains and be inside of that love affair. And then that turns all this stuff like catastrophe. This is the path of joy, actually, and it's the path of bliss. Because in order to actually have happiness, you have to, what's the first step? You gotta admit, we got a problem. And then the second step is then you name it, you identify it. Here's one example of how that can happen. 4 catastrophes: spiritual catastrophe, racial catastrophe, economic catastrophe, and whatever the other one was. So then when you can kind of identify those things, then it's like identifying the patterns in our own mind. And as soon as I identify, I didn't realize I was a bit of a narcissist. That's a hard thing to come to grips with. And for many people, it's the case. Tendencies towards more narcissism. It's not some horrible thing. We're all trying our best. But when we come to the critical awareness or that sort of very tender, vulnerable recognition that I am not only participating in my own suffering, but I am participating in the suffering of others, it'll make you want to cry. It's not a bad thing to realize that. It's a great thing to realize that. Because naturally, as soon as you realize that, you want that to change. Because why? At the center of each of us is goodness. At the center of each of us is love. Definitely. And so that's the most difficult and the most wonderful part of a Dharma practice, is it's doing both of those things simultaneously. By opening up the field of awareness, you recognize the greatness that is there. That means you recognizing your interconnected dimension. It comes with a type of feeling of it's majestic. It gives you a feeling of your own beauty, actually, and your own sense of kind of living creative intelligence that each unique organism is. Everybody has these totally unique bodies, totally unique stories, but we get stuck in the mud. And so while it's simultaneously doing that, though, it's simultaneously, because that once that field of awareness is opening up, it reveals the tendencies that are contributing to your own suffering, my own suffering, and the suffering, and how my tendencies are also contributing to others' suffering, even just in my perspectives and the way I think about things. So that's the harder part to witness, but it's essential in that just witnessing it starts to change it. The whole thing, though, starts and ends with compassion. Because if I'm not actively making sure that before anything else, before I'm working on self-purification, it's not really pure, we say that, but it's not purification of the self. It's purification of the mind and the tendencies of the mind that obstruct your experience of the self, of the real self. And so as soon as I say I notice my kind of like inner narcissism, anyone ever done that before? Notice their inner narcissism? No, it's just me. I feel really awkward. Well, first it sucks, you know. First it's like, ugh. But what does it do? Just by witnessing it, it starts to change it. If you're honest, because you can't really witness and not be honest. So it's this being honest, and if we actually want to be happy, then we have to also want those around us to be happy. And if we want those around us to be happy, then we also have to pay attention to how we are affecting those around us. So it starts and ends with compassion, and that's a muscle that we shouldn't just expect is already developed. It's developed in some ways. We all naturally, if we see like an animal, like a sweet dog or something who's suffering and in pain, then immediately our hearts are like, oh, you have to really be, have a cold heart to not feel compassion for like a sweet animal suffering. So it's already there. But what takes the muscle that has to be developed is to, as soon as you notice something that you don't like about yourself, or you think there's something about you that others don't like, or whatever, have we developed the compassion muscle that responds to that? Is compassion and love towards yourself the first thing we feel? Or is it self-condemnation is the first thing that we feel? Yeah. So, if it is the first thing that we feel, maybe the second thing that we feel is deep compassion, because why? We noticed we're suffering. And that's what I do, is in order for to get really compassion practices to come alive for me, the only way I've figured out to be able how to do that is I start with myself. I can't start going outward before I start here, for me, for my development. And so I first actively reflect on and remind myself that I do want to be happy, and it's good to tell my mind that, because it already knows it, and it's already doing all the things it does as an instinctive and subconscious attempt to be happy. Get me the coffee, limited thing. Who's it? Who is it? I hope this happens. It's always trying to be happy, but it's doing it in a scattered way. So, taking a moment to just reflect and remind myself that I do wish to be happy, and that'll automatically remind me that the mind's attempt to create happiness is often the very thing that robs it of its happiness, because it's grasping after things, and it's pushing away the things that it doesn't like, even though those might be the things that need to come. Then I think about my own difficult predicament of being in a human body, knowing that one day I will die, knowing that one day my loved ones will also die, and that this thing is totally impermanent. And I remember how I'm suffering. And I remember how I don't want to suffer. And it seems like, well, that's a kind of a drag way to start the day. I thought it was like, what do we say on Instagram nowadays? Like, I can't remember. I wish I would have nailed that. There's a cliche I'm looking for. No. Anyways, sounds like a kind of not a great way to start the day, remembering that you will die. But it is a great way to start the day, because immediately it brings things into the center. and you get connected to what your life is about at even a little subtle level, and it doesn't make you sad, especially with practice, it doesn't make you feel heavy, it's like, good job by me for making a moment to reflect on impermanence. Especially when we're experiencing interconnected nature of things, we're less and less scared of dying. But it always connects us to what the Dharma of our life is by reflecting on that. Time is ticking. And then I think about how I am already happy in a lot of ways. And it's really easy to lose track of it and lose perspective. And so part 3 is counting your blessings. I count my blessings. And I think about it, and then I make the wish, may all those feelings overflow. Yep. And then I move on and I think about, this is just practicing what the Buddha called the 4 immeasurables. Also Patanjali speaks of the 4 immeasurables in the Yoga Sutras. It's a practice. And so then you move on to a loved one and how much they want to be happy. Imagine that they're suffering. And one technique is you think of your most loved one that you care about the most that you can think of in that moment, and you think of them terribly suffering. If you're already like emoting with compassion, no reason to do that. But if you're feeling like I just woke up and I'm like really would rather be getting coffee or tea but yet I said I was going to do these stupid 4 immeasurables, then that would be a good time to think about, this is life. This is sometimes how it is. No, it's just me again. Somebody else needs to get up here and teach this class. I feel like a mess. So then you think of the loved one, and sometimes yes, and that's what these Tibetan practices do, is they'll visualize their mothers going in terrible suffering with specific visualizations in order to arouse the feeling of great compassion. And as soon as they arouse the feeling of compassion, they immediately transfer it to a more subtle field, which is the field of all living beings, what they call their countless mothers, with the belief that they've lived so many lifetimes over and over that everyone at some point, every living thing at some point has already been their mother. Maybe that's true from some like materialists can't get their head around those ideas. It's just like immediately defunct. But if you're less concerned about that materialism and you more like to practice this stuff as an art, then you realize that that's a very advantageous perspective to hold. And so then once you arouse your heart in that way, starting with oneself, moving to a loved one, then you can move to an adversary. So if there's someone in the world or in your life personally that's really triggering you and is adversarial, then you go through those same things with them. And then finally, the more subtle level is the endless neutrals. They're not your friend and they're not your enemy. They're just endless lives. And it's having those same wishes with that same kind of feeling and emotion for, like Dalai Lama's favorite prayers, as long as space endures, as long as time remains, may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. A bodhisattva's vow. And that's how the Dharma practitioner in a certain way becomes an activist, a Dharma warrior, like which is bodhisattva, where one commits themselves. Martin Luther King Jr. is a bodhisattva. There's no doubt about it. And so we all can be that. It doesn't mean being famous or being in each of our stories are heroic. And to tune into that's what yoga practice, and that's what really LFA is all about, truly, is creating a space where we're not only remaining connectivity to that reality, but we're blossoming it, we're making it strong. Our own magnetism, our own meaningfulness in life, purposefulness. And I don't know what your purpose is, but I know it always, with all of us, it always has to do with serving others. It always has to do with serving others. And so if we're not quite sure, how can you be helpful? How can we be helpful?
Thanks for watching on YouTube. Best easy way to stay in touch with us. Hit the subscribe button here. You'll see our videos when they come up. If you enjoyed this one, hit the like button. It'll help more people see it, help the channel grow. I appreciate you watching.